Hello! In this video we're going to talk about the anatomy of a React application. The first thing we're going to do is run create React app. I'm going to call this one 01-anatomy of a React app. So before we talk about a lot of the intricacies of React, I just want to look at what's created when we run create React app and become a little bit more familiar with everything in that we see in Visual Studio Code here. So I'm going to cd into the anatomy of the React application and open it in Visual Studio Code. And let's also go ahead and run yarn start to open this in our browser. So it should be booting up here right now. There it is. We get that nice spinning React logo. And let's just see what's happening here. So the only file that we've looked at is this application file. And we can see the application file has a pretty direct relationship with what we're seeing on the page. So if we start at just looking at the logo and we look at the HTML source, we see that the HTML source has an image on line 10, and that corresponds very directly. In fact, we can see here it describes it in the source as app-logo. It has an accessible alt name describing it as the logo. And even if we just try and delete this and save that file, that is definitively the logo of the page. So often when I'm developing in any sort of project, I like to do a lot of sanity checks to make sure that the code I'm looking at actually is the thing I think it is on the page. So it looks like this is a we have a pretty one-to-one relationship between the image in the code and the image on the page. Here's the paragraph on the page and the paragraph in the code. And we have the link. So the link telling us that we can click on it to learn React, and it looks like it'll take us back to reactjs.org. So we see those things, and that's all very clear. But let's look a little bit more up the chain and down the chain to see where these things are going. For instance, I bet that the source attribute on the image is new for you. So let's take a moment to talk about that. The way that we're used to seeing image sources defined in vanilla HTML might look something like this. It might look something like image source equals, open some quotation marks and type http:/logo.jpg. Well, that's not what we see down here. In fact, we don't even see a URL. We don't even see quotation marks. So what React uses is React uses a language called JSX. And JSX allows us to refer to more sophisticated things in our templates than just strings. For instance, if we follow this word logo back up, it actually represents a variable, a JavaScript variable that exists in this page. And if I click on that, the Visual Studio Code is actually highlighting it to show us that this variable logo comes in from an import statement. And if we read the rest of that import statement, we see import logo from logo.svg. And the dot in front of that slash means it's a local path. So this should be a file called logo.svg that resides right beside this app.js file. And if we look over here at the files in our project, indeed there is a file called logo.svg. In fact, let's open that up. Well, this is a scalable vector graphics format file. So if we look at it, we're actually just looking at the math that defines that image. So let's see if we can show it in Finder. Yeah, if I open it in Finder, it does show actually that image. But this is good. Now we're seeing a little bit. All we're doing is we're following things to make sure that we can put a finger on everything at every step of the way. So that's actually, you might find that weird. The fact that you're importing a image inside of a JavaScript file. Well, that's what the React ecosystem looks like. In fact, that's what this whole video is dedicated. This lesson is dedicated to us getting used to the concept of importing things that we would not normally consider code. This is funny. I'm actually just noticing here the file not found rotating logo image over here because I made up the URL. Let me delete that real quick. So what happens is, throughout our projects, we're going to see us import things that are not JavaScript. So we have 3 import statements in this file. We have we're importing React itself from the React library. We're also accessing the component class from within the React library. The curly braces allow us to reach further inside React. So it's called object destructuring. If we did not import it with these curly braces, all that means is we would have to delete this, and we would have to refer to component down here as react.component. But as it turns out, because we don't want to write react.component, we can destructure it as we import it and get direct access to that. So when we import the logo from this file, well, the environment that we're in notices that it's an SVG, and it makes it available for the image tag. So if we actually look at if we use our Chrome DevTools to investigate this over here, we can investigate the image tag, and we see that it actually has a fully qualified URL, so it's actually served at static media logo with a hash to identify it. Basically what this means is when our application is run, we have a bunch of tools that bundle up all of this and eventually translate it so it makes sense in the browser. So we're actually able to, when I have this logo here, we're actually able to refer to it as a real JavaScript variable that was imported from a file, but we have a bunch of bundlers that are able to identify every file and transform them in special ways so that they make sense by the time they get to the browser. Similarly, just by saying import the app CSS, that will eventually be translated to a CSS link in our HTML source. Let's investigate that. So if I view the source here, I'm looking for the CSS. Well, I don't see it over here. Let's look on the inspect. Here's a link to the shortcut. Well, how about looking at the image to try and figure out exactly where that is? So if we look and inspect just the image, it has class app logo applied to it. So I'm looking at app logo to see where that is. And here we go. I didn't see it at first, but we actually have a style tag that's included in the entire page. So I was looking for a link tag, but it looks like it actually inputs the entire CSS in there. So when we import app.css, our entire bundling tools will find out where that CSS file is, and when this entire application gets bundled together, it looks like it inlines it there. So I wanted to take time to point this out because I do think these things are atypical coming from a regular vanilla HTML background, but get used to importing things like this in React. Generally, when you import something, it's going to run through a special tool which will modify it and ultimately bundle it into our application when the application is served. So when we do that for an image, the image is, when we looked at that, the image was actually being served from a static directory. And what that means for something like when we import CSS, in this instance, we're seeing the CSS actually be inserted into the document itself. But where the heck is all the application going? So we've only looked at the application.js file here, and we haven't seen anything else in this application. So let's take a look at what other files are available here. There's an app CSS file, the app.js file, which is where we are, and index.js. Let's take a look at that. So index.js is actually going to be some of the heart of our application here. Or rather, this file tells us how to take this app class that we've created and tells us where to insert it into a regular HTML web page. So notice that inside the app class, we created a class app, which is built out of this component, which comes from React, and we export that from this file. So what the app is a component. It's a React component, and it just has a method called render, which defines what is actually displayed for this component. Now, if we go to the index file, we can see the import statements, and we see that we import that app that we just created. And what this file uses is something called React DOM to render that app that we created inside of an element on the page. So here we have some classic vanilla JavaScript, document.getElementById. We're looking for something with an ID of root, and we're saying take this application and render that application inside of this root element. So let's look at the public folder and index.html. If we look at index.html, it has lots of normal vanilla HTML defined. For instance, here's React app. There's a title. We can see that as the title of the page in the tab. And we can see here, there's the div with that ID of root. So really what this entire page is doing is we have a basic HTML page, and we're actually inserting the React app inside this page. For instance, I could actually add some paragraphs here. I'm going to call it HTML. I'm going to call it app begin. And I'm going to call it app end. And if we save that, we can see over here, there's my paragraph that says the app began. Now we see our actual app, and there's where the app ended. So this is really the entire, every level of a React application. Down here, we're rather zoomed in, or zoomed out. We have the index.html page. Ultimately, that defines the root. Now we have index.js page. And the index.js page combines the index.html page and the app.js by grabbing the root element on the HTML page and telling React to render our application on that element. And again, back in the app JavaScript page, we see that this is really the heart of our application, where we define exactly what sort of content we want, and we've even gone and imported things like that image and imported CSS rules. So there is a good overview of just the general anatomy of a React application.